After watching Castlevania Nocturne, and the original Castlevania, 1-to-1 once more, I find myself with the overall opinion that whilst Nocturne was decent, it fell flat of what Castlevania accomplished in 4 episodes, despite having 8. The music was poorly positioned, and at regular times it really felt like they were just refusing to use popular tracks like Bloody Tears. The sound design kind of felt rushed, and the character storylines were just perplexing. I'll be fair and say that Nocturne was always positioned to have a bad time. It opens without Dracula, doesn't have his castle, and it comes off the bat of the Belmont ultimate fight with Death. It's pretty hard to trump fighting Death. Where do you really go from there? But in a video game, you just run it back. Castlevania rolls it back to Dracula pretty much every time, because of course you do. It's hard to not have sympathy for the writers of this Castlevania that the previous ended in such a neat and well-rounded way. In the prior series, Dracula is redeemed, in a sense anyway, so it's hard to see why he'd return as a villain here. His advanced technology could still work in this setting, but without the castle to back it up, it's sort of less imposing. In fact, Nocturne has a serious problem with a lack of energy. Dracula is a hard person to replace, and Nocturne's Olrox does a fantastic job, at least in the first 10 minutes, only to disappear from our screens for quite a while. The intro episode for Castlevania Nocturne brings in around 6 to 7 main characters, give or take, that will likely be shown throughout the entire series. This rapid introduction of faces is in stark contrast to the slower development of the first series, and again, we stand at the 4 detailed episodes versus 8 problem. So, let's expand on that. What is Nocturne doing that is so poor in its storytelling? If we compare Castlevania v Nocturne, the problem comes down to a severe lack of focus. In the first series, each episode of the season brings out a singular character. Sometimes their stories bleed over into the next episode, but it gives you a kind of rough premise and a single moment in those 4 episodes. Episode 1 is Dracula and the fall of Wallachia. Episode 2 is Trevor and the establishment of the Belmonts. It's funny but dark, a mix of showing who this man is. Then we go to episode 2 and 3, which give details on the speakers, and we meet Cypher for the culmination of her plots and powers in episode 4, where finally we see the building of the Ark come together with the spark of the Belmont's renewed vigour and the unveiling of Alucard, who is the shortest introduction but is introduced via a full-length battle sequence filled with quips that cut across Trevor's brutish swearing and laissez-faire attitude. Remarks like, "Please, this isn't a bar fight, have some class," immediately come to mind. But let's compare this back to Nocturne and its opening. The first episode has a stellar introduction to Olrox and Richter. Richter's fear of Olrox is foreshadowed very nicely, and the brutality of vampirism is returned with the battle between him and his mother, and the ultimate dying at the hands of Olrox, kind of because of Richter. But it's immediately cut across by Maria and the French Revolution narrative. Not a problem, it's initially just setting, it's world building. Where are we going, what's going on? Rather than build a bigger picture of France though, the story keeps its inward kind of microcosm, just covering a very small portion of that and not really showing us much of the other surrounding narrative. We see the vampires, but they get slain immediately by Richter and Maria. It's kind of no big deal. So they discover vampires in the area and alert the church, which introduces more characters. Then they get attacked at their home and saved by more characters. Are you starting to see a problem yet? Episode 2 continues this trend by introducing the first hints of our villains and the Vampire Messiah. We get Terra's flashback about the villains to show how evil they are, and the long scene of Edward singing opera for a dead bird and Maria's, which just kind of feels unearned. We don't know this character, and unfortunately it just sounds kind of bad. The man singing is probably fine, but it's backed poorly in the show and the scene really isn't doing anything for him. Ultimately I watched this and it just kind of came off as amateurish to me, and just a huge death flag. And well, it is a death flag, as later in the episode Annette breaks from cover when seeing a vampire abuser and exposes the heroes immediately, gets Edward caught and killed. She at no point ever seems to acknowledge this, by the way, and spends more time blaming Richter for his failings than recognising our own. But, as to be expected, by episode 3 we have completely gone off the rails. Richter is essentially not in this episode at all, and if you're watching Castlevania for the Belmonts, then this just isn't the episode for you, or the season. Instead, Annette takes to the stage with a poorly written display of white slavery in the Caribbean by calling slave owners vampires and displaying them as such. Horrocks appears later, thankfully, but everything is emotional whiplash at this point. We jump from Horrocks to the vampire villains to Richter, and Maria again being attacked by night creatures, one of the resurrected being Edouard. Also, forgive my pronunciation of that name, no matter how many times I practice it, I can't help but get it wrong. I'm trying, but, you know. Now at this point we can abandon any episodic similarities as they go completely off the rails in writing. Nocturne has the same failings as the original, which kind of feels like budget limitations, but on review, the pacing and the real key issues just come down to one thing in my mind, and it's the writing. Which isn't surprising, given that there's been a writer change from the previous series. It's really clear to see how this has just affected the show. Characters speak differently, and the scenes just have a different tone to them, as well as the overall world building. It's just clearly different, and it stands out in a way that if you've seen the previous series and enjoyed it, you will notice it. The original Castlevania has a bleak, almost berserk-esque setting in the first series where the brutality is displayed. This could mirror in Nocturne with the French Revolution. It's not a pretty time period. Nocturne had the ability, really, to just be some kind of Bloodborne-esque display of human cruelty and monstrous barbarism. Instead, it relies on very weak themes of it and just displays of neck-biting to ham up the torture. It doesn't come across anywhere near the same. The devious nature of humans and God is just so underplayed in Nocturne, whilst a key opening theme of the first, and one that really should be on display here. The abbot never actually gives any real credence to his decision to join the vampires. There's this highlighted conflict with the ransacking of churches and the aristocracy being killed in France, but the show could do to actually give some kind of perspective here of why that's even bad for a modern audience, which, let's be honest, probably sees the killing of clergymen and the aristocracy as a good thing. I mean, let's consider the political climate in the current day. We were given a chance for Dracula to be sympathetic and the human cruelty to be shown up before, so why not now? Not every villain needs to be redeemable, that is fair, and they don't all need to have a good reason. Some can just be bastards, that's fine, but every villain does tend to think that they are the hero, or at least the most important character in the story, surely. Nocturne's villains in the Abbot and Elizabeth certainly talk and act like they do, but they really do a terrible job of actually showing that, or giving any kind of theology as to why they do these things. They might say it's for the new vampire society, or for God. But where's the proof? Where is the courage in their actions? Drolta, the villain and henchwoman, has more interesting scenes than either of them, and Horrocks completely steals the show in terms of just being a charismatic fill-in that we're missing in the Vampire Cabal. Neither are kind of good or bad, they just kind of do what they're told. They could feasibly be on either side if they wanted to, if either were advantageous to them. But they just kind of fail to do anything with these characters. For Horrocks, they seem to dislike Elizabeth, but he also killed Belmont's mother, and it creates an interesting intrigue. Is he bad? Is he good? We don't really know, but we do end up rooting for him and finding him more interesting than the actual main villain in the Egyptian goddess dark power wielding Elizabeth, whose powers are, yes, by the end of the show, at least shown, they seem to be there, but her ultimate ability is the rehashing of something from the earlier series in this power of eternal darkness, which does scare Horrocks, or at least perplex him, we don't know, but it's not very original. It doesn't stand out from that which Dracula had. Dracula brought on rains of blood, demons and fire, and she just makes the sun disappear. I mean, it means a lot, certainly, but it doesn't have anywhere near the scale and impact. And her high level power is becoming bigger, and damage immunity? That's seemingly what it seems to do, at least in the final battle in the church. It just visually doesn't look good. As a viewer, without knowledge of the previous Castlevania, this all feels doable, but with knowledge of it, God, it's a mockery and boring. There are a number of just rushed visuals and fight scenes that could look a lot better and would be better with more music involved, but instead they lean heavily on this theming of the opera and Edward, but it doesn't come out the same. And the only ingredients that we have to make the villain strong is her getting bigger and doing really nothing impressive but walking and not taking damage. It's just a far cry from the villains of the first series. Unfortunately, Nocturne's writing feels like a Marvel-esque kind of escapade. It's just frankly shocking when I learned that it was written by a Brit and not an American, because it had such an American feel. Richter also just hasn't had any opportunity to share anywhere near the same degree of charm that Trevor Belmont has. Now, I'll be fair here, Trevor is clearly older, more world-weary, has been through a lot. Richter is a coddled boy who lost his mother, gained another mother, and at the end of the season apparently just loses her mother again? But there's no scene where Richter gets to compare anywhere near to Trevor. Trevor has the opening tavern scene in which you immediately see what he's about. It's so obvious the kind of character that he is. Richter's opening scene, in comparison, is him being saved by Annette. Yes, he gets to do some stuff with Maria, he gets to kill vampires, but there's nothing big, there's nothing that tells you this is what he's about. He's just a young teenager playing Belmont. He isn't really a Belmont. Even in his advertised return to magic scene, the big tumultuous scene with just his grandfather, they can't resist not giving him a chance to have characterization, and instead he has a Marvel quip of, "This is where I'd say something fun and witty, but fuck it." No, Richter, why don't you say something? Why don't you say something fun, witty, a joke, anything that would give you a bit of character? This, if done by Trevor, could work. There would be a bit more to it. We would know more about him. He has the kind of badass background to say this. But this is essentially a teenager saying this kind of line. It doesn't work. Across 8 episodes, Richter ultimately comes out feeling like he had less screen time than Trevor's 3 episodes. Nocturne's greatest crime against his characters comes again and again on its refusal to set anything up, to let any one character shine but Annette, who repeatedly badmouths Richter, going so far as to just call him a pussy randomly and rage about his lack of control, when it's she who sets the entire downward spiral into motion in Nocturne. So with that as a background, let's actually get into Annette, shall we? Wikipedia says this: Mary Sue is a character archetype in fiction, usually a young woman, who is often portrayed inexplicably competent across all domains, gifted with unique talents or powers, liked or respected by other characters, unrealistically free of weaknesses, extremely attractive, innately virtuous, and or generally lacking meaningful character flaws. So, Annette in Castlevania Nocturne. Annette, as a character alone, is fine. She could be a good main character and has times of doing that. However, she feels like a character that is essentially just, well, she has no place in the plot. She shows up to deal with the villain because of warnings from home, but we already have Richter, Maria, and later Alucard. So we're getting a 4th character. For what reason? Well, I guess it doesn't matter. Never mind. More characters, more good, right? It could be fine. There are plenty of interesting characters in Castlevania, like the Forge Masters. However, Annette is just brash, and her interesting plot devices are ham-fisted in their use. Representation in Castlevania has always been interesting. The first series was, in my opinion, pretty good at this, with characters coming from all over. Isaac and Marana come to mind, with more kind of African and Middle Eastern roots. Sure, sexuality rise, Castlevania is all over the shop without a care. Lesbian, gay, whatever. Who cares? That's here again in Nocturne. You see it almost immediately with Aurochs. But, okay. And this is a big but. Annette's backstory is rather, well, disappointing. It's not the idea of it. I certainly think that the premise of Vampire Slave Masters could work, but it comes across as a cop-out to call the white slave owners vampires and have them handily get wiped out by the uprising of Caribbean slaves. It's all done so neatly, tied up with a bow. But okay, that's fine. It's a way to show the suffering they've been through. Okay, shows where she's from, it's dealt with handily. I just feel it's dealt with very, very modern day in its setting. There's brutality, but it's all neatly dealt with. There's white people that are bad, but oh, they're vampires. Okay, sure. Kind of feels degrading, but whatever. However weak that I feel it is, we'll move on. It does bring about an interesting villain for her, the vampire slave owner, that travels to France, or at least it would, but she immediately kills him the moment she gets time alone with him, which kind of negates the backstory's impact almost immediately. We see the proper fear of having this trauma in Richter, dealing with his mother's killer in Aurochs, but for Annette it's just another day at work, a 9 till 5 to deal with that kind of trauma. Trauma which should be worse, because she dealt with it in a much worse situation. But, okay, fine. She's dealt with it, she overcomes it, sure. But the empowerment given to Annette just ends up feeling cheap and unearned, whilst also coming across as just poor representation in a series which hasn't had issues with representation. Aurochs is a brilliant character for this. He is from South America in the Aztec kind of Middle America, South America theme. He's a villain, yes, but a character that people like. Very likeable elements, very interesting, a lot going on. And most importantly, he's a character where the fact that he is a person of colour doesn't kind of be his whole being, which at times it does feel like that is Annette's role in the story, to be a person of colour. It's frustrating. Annette has all the opportunity and screen time, but comes off as rude and abrupt, with her story having to take priority over the Belmont boy, who is arguably Castlevania. Why are you watching Castlevania if you don't want to see the Belmonts? They're the fucking show. But I don't know. At that point, no one ever just argues back at her. No one talks back. No one deals with her attitude or her problems. She causes so much strife from the show, and yet just kind of gets away with it. It's frustrating. And I really, really hope that the introduction of Alucard at the end acts as some kind of foil to her in the second season. But I really just feel like what's going to happen is he'll get walked over as well. That he will ultimately be talked down to, and she'll fulfill the role that Trevor Belmont did in kind of having this brash back and forth with him. But it just doesn't feel like it works. There's even hints of Richter having some kind of possible romance or interest in Annette, which, why? It just doesn't feel earned. Everything in this show is unearned. That is Nocturne, a season of unearned attempts at building a big narrative with Marvel-like twists. It reminds me of World of Warcraft's current writing team, jamming in 3 seasons worth of content into one and then being perplexed why no one comes out of this happy, since no one has the real focus as the main character. The only character that comes anywhere near to this is a just brash Mary Sue, which is unlikable. It's disappointing. Castlevania Nocturne is at best a 5, maybe a 6 out of 10. It's worth a watch, but it just ends up feeling like The Witcher all over again. And that is, as someone that liked the last series, just disappointing. Very disappointing. Still, I'll still check out Season 2. I hold hopes that maybe it will get better, but we will see. Still, thanks for watching everyone. I will see you in the next video, and please do consider dropping a like, subscribing to the channel, or even supporting me down on Patreon below.